What's up guys, I'm Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV-MC. Today I'm going to show you how to rebuild the top end on your Yamaha Blaster. There's a couple reasons you might rebuild the top end on your Yamaha Blaster. Number one, you could have a part failure. Number two, could just be from normal wear. Now, as the top end wears out, eventually it's going to be easier to kick over and it's going to be harder to start. You can verify that the top end is worn out by doing a compression test. Typically on these machines, you're going to be 135 to 155 PSI, but a good way to test this is during your routine maintenance, do a compression check and compare those to later readings down the road. And that's going to tell you when the top end is actually wearing out. So with that being said, we're going to show you how to do it on this 2006 Yamaha Blaster 200. The process is going to be similar for just about any Yamaha Blaster all the way back to 1988 when they had the first one. So whatever machine you're working on, just make sure you reference your model specific service manual for more information and specs. To do this job, we're using the QA Parts cylinder and piston kit. This just makes the job really easy because it comes with everything you need to get the job done on most machines. So what the kit comes with is your piston, wrist pin bearing, circlips, piston rings, your gaskets, and it even comes with a spark plug. Now, the only thing it doesn't come with is the exhaust flange gasket, but that's fairly inexpensive, so you can pick that up separately. Now, for any of these parts, you can click the link in the description below to pick them up. You want to start out with a clean machine. We've already washed ours off. So from here, we need to remove our seat, the front cover, and the gas tank cover. Next, we're going to remove the fuel tank. So make sure you have the petcock in the off position and disconnect the fuel line. And then we'll remove the two remaining bolts in the front of the gas tank. Next, I've set a drain pen underneath the drain for the carburetor. We're going to loosen that screw on the bottom, let all the fuel drain out, and then remove the carburetor. Now, a couple things about removing your carburetor. So we have this rubber cap right here. Normally you have an oil injection line running right in there. So most machines you're going to disconnect that, but if you have an oil block off kit like ours, you don't need to worry about that. Some machines are going to have TORS, some are not. So we have the TORS system on ours. We're not actually going to disconnect our throttle cable, but the TORS does have an electrical connection, so we'll disconnect that. And then we're just going to loosen up both of the clamps on the rubber boots. We're going to pop the carburetor back and out of the way and then just zip tie it to the handlebars. Now, I know we're just getting to the good stuff, but it's really important to put a fresh air filter in once you have everything back together. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and clean my air filter, make sure I get any dirt out of there, and that way it can be drying while I put the piston in. Next, we're going to remove our spark plug cap. After that, we're going to remove the intake boot and the reed cage. The next step is to remove the exhaust pipe. Now, you don't need to remove the fenders like we did. We also removed the supports just to better show the process. This pipe will roll out to the left side even with those fenders installed. So with that being said, you need to start out by removing those two flange nuts that mount right up to the cylinder. Then you want to loosen up the clamp that connects this to the silencer. Disconnect this mount up top, and then we can just simply roll this out. Now we can take our spark plug wrench and remove our spark plug. Now the spark plug is the window to the combustion chamber. You can tell what's actually happening inside the cylinder. So with that, you can see ours is black and wet. That means our engine is running rich and we need to find out why. Probably need to make some adjustments to our jetting. Now typically you want the insulator to be brown in there. If it's white, it's too lean. Now sometimes you can see some gray material in here. That means it's actually material from your piston. Something is terribly wrong in there. And if you see any copper chunks, that's actually from your connecting rod. So pay attention to those things and make adjustments as necessary. But from here we can move on, and we're going to remove the 6 bolts holding the cylinder head on. And we're going to loosen those up in a crisscross pattern. So once you have the nuts and the washers out of the way, you can break the cylinder head free. If this thing is stuck, you can use a dead blow hammer or rubber mallet to help knock it off. But if you do that, be really careful because it's easy to break these fins. Then we can remove the cylinder head gasket. And for us, we need to remove these studs because We're going to put that new cylinder on there, but the new cylinder does not have the studs already installed. Now to remove the studs, there's two different ways to do it. First way, you can reinstall one of these cylinder head bolts, take another one, you'll jam these together and then loosen it up that way. It's a little more work. The easy way to do it is to take one of those Bike Master stud removal sockets. This is the 8mm. We're just going to stick that over, turn it counterclockwise till it locks up. Now when we do this, if these break free easy, we're just going to pull them all out. But if they don't want to come out, what we're going to do is take the cylinder off. We're going to heat this up with a torch and then remove all the cylinder head studs, or sorry, the cylinder studs. And there you have it. So the best part about this tool is it's super easy to use and you're not going to damage your threads. Next, I'm going to lower this piston to the lowest point, or BDC. Now you want to take your 12mm wrench and remove the 4 base nuts. Now we actually have a special tool that is designed for assembly, but it's going to help us get a little extra leverage to remove those nuts. And as always, we're loosening these in a crisscross pattern. We've got our clutch cable bracket. Then once you have all 4 nuts removed, you can go ahead and wiggle the cylinder free and remove it. Again, if it's stuck, you can lightly use a deadbolt hammer or a rubber mallet to tap on this. Just be aware, if you hit too hard, you're going to damage these fins. So when we pulled the cylinder up, it actually pulled the piston with it. You can see this piston is toast, but before we remove it, you want to place a rag around the connecting rod, and that way nothing can drop into the bottom end. Now we can remove one of the circlips. It doesn't matter which one. You'll notice there's a cutout right by the circlip. We're going to use some small needle nose pliers. We'll go in the cutout, and that's going to allow us to remove that clip. Now for the next step, if you can, just press out the piston pin or wrist pin. If it doesn't easily press out, then you don't want to hit on this with a hammer. What you're going to do is use a piston pin puller. So our wrist pin is actually stuck. So the piston pin puller, what we're going to do, there's a few different adapters. This one fits nice against our piston. We've got a little collet that it's going to be small enough diameter that it can actually pull through. We'll thread that onto the back. We've already greased up the threads on everything. And then from here, we just need to turn this out. So I've got my 14mm wrench. I'll spin this out. There it is. Then with the piston off, we can go ahead and remove that needle bearing for the wrist pin. Since we have this rag in the bottom end, we can go ahead and clean some of this stuff up. So we have a lot of corrosion on these studs. I'm just going to clean that off with a wire brush. After that, we can remove the base gasket. And then looks like our gasket came off in one piece pretty well, but still going to run this gasket scraper across here and remove anything that was left behind. Then we'll go back over it with a rag and some contact cleaner. Now we can remove this rag, and if any of those little pieces of gasket got down in here, make sure you wipe them out. Next, we'll inspect the connecting rod. So with this, really you're looking for visible damage on the small end. If you do want to take measurements, you can find those in your service manual. But if you see any grooving or pitting or any visible damage to this, then you definitely need to get it replaced. Now for the big end down here, this is going to have side-to-side play, but you don't want any up and down play at all. So since it does have side play, you don't want to confuse that with up and down. So I'm going to slide it to one side and then pull straight up and down on it. And if you feel any play straight up and down, then you need to get it replaced. Now, if you're not quite sure if you feel something or not, one thing you can do is you can use a feeler gauge and you can measure between that shim on the side of the connecting rod and that crank web. So the service limit on this is 0.7mm. So I'm just going to start with that. That does not fit in there. So this is not out of specifications. But if the 0.7 slides in, go one size up. And if that still slides in, then you definitely need to get this rebuilt. The next step is to clean and inspect our parts to make sure they're good to reuse. Now, again, we don't need to do anything with this cylinder. We're using a brand new one, but we'll show you how to do this just in case you are reusing your stock cylinder. So first thing we're going to do is clean up the gasket sealing surfaces. So we've got this reed cage gasket right here we need to scrape off. And if you have any little spots that are stuck, you can always use little Scotch-Brite and wipe that down. You'll do the same thing for the cylinder head gasket surfaces, both on the head and the cylinder. And then same thing, you know, for this base gasket, you want to make sure that's cleaned up good. Scrape that off. Then don't forget you have this exhaust gasket, so I'm going to go ahead and remove that. Definitely want to wipe that out in there. The last thing we need to clean on the cylinder is right at the top. Sometimes there's some carbon that builds up right there. We're just going to remove it to help us with inspection. Moving on to the cylinder head, we already talked about the gasket sealing surface, but all this carbon in here, we need to clean it out. So we're just going to use some carbon clean and some Scotch-Brite. You might have to let that carbon clean soak for a little bit. You can use a wire wheel attachment on a drill, but you need to be really careful if you do that. You don't want to damage the gasket sealing surface. And one more tip, if you're going to be cleaning this out, I recommend putting the spark plug back in place. That way you don't get a bunch of carbon down in those spark plug threads. Now moving on to the reed cage, if you see any leftover gasket material on that, you want to get that scraped off. Then we're just going to clean all the dirt off of this and that intake boot. The next step is to inspect our parts. We're going to start with the cylinder, and with this there are several different sizes of pistons available for it. So depending how bad this is determines whether or not we can reuse it or if it needs to be replaced. So with this, a couple of quick checks you can make. Number one, you're going to check for a ring ridge. That's the highest point the piston ring travels inside the cylinder. If you feel a groove there, or if you feel scoring or grooves going down the front and the back of the cylinder that actually catch your fingernail if you run it across there, then you know you have damage that needs to be repaired on this cylinder. But if everything looks good, what you can do is actually take a measurement. So the standard bore is going to be 66 millimeters, and to get an accurate measurement on this, you're going to need a dial bore gauge. Most people won't have that. So all you're going to do is take your digital calipers, and that's going to tell you if you have a standard bore or not. So it doesn't have to be super accurate on this one. So on ours, we are the standard bore, that's 66 millimeters. And you know, if all this is looking good, all we would have to do is run a ball hone down through this, deglaze it, and then we'd wash it out with warm soapy water, and we can run our new parts or a stock OEM size piston. But if you run into any other scenarios, maybe you have some deep grooving or whatever that needs to be repaired, you can actually take this to the machine shop, have them bore it out and match that new piston size. One other thing you're going to look out for in the cylinder is sometimes some of this aluminum can actually transfer over to the cylinder wall. You can clean that off with a little bit of muriatic acid, but follow all of the safety precautions if you do that. Next, we're going to look at a few different pistons. So this one actually came out of our Blaster, and you can see some obvious scoring damage to it. Those score marks are typically an indicator of overheating. If it's caused by a lack of lubrication, you'll have a dull appearance, which doesn't seem to be the case with ours. But we do have some caramel color below the rings, which is an indicator of blow-by. Now this other piston is another example of what can happen if your engine gets too hot. So I don't know if it had low coolant, maybe the mixture was too lean, but right on that exhaust side, this piston actually started to transfer material onto the cylinder. So, you know, find out what's going on there if you see things like this happening to your piston. Now the piston on my right either had detonation or pre-ignition going on. This could be caused by lean air fuel mixture, maybe the ignition timing was off, low octane, anything like that. You could have a hot spot inside the combustion chamber. The last thing worth mentioning is that a piston with dull scratch marks is an indicator of dirt getting past the air filter. But the point is, with all this stuff, just make sure if any of these problems showed up on the piston you took out, make sure you get those problems fixed before you put your new parts in so they don't get damaged in the same way. Now, if you saw any signs of overheating, you definitely want to check your cylinder head for warpage. Same thing with the top of your cylinder. So with this, what you're going to do is take a machine surface. The limit is 0.03 millimeters. You're going to try to slide that feeler gauge underneath or in between the machine surface and the cylinder head. And you're going to do that in a square and make an X across here. If it goes through at any point, try to go one bigger. If that goes under there, you're definitely going to need this to be resurfaced. Next, we're going to check these reeds. So with these, the main thing you're looking for is just making sure there's not a gap between the reed itself and the reed cage. If there's a small gap, super teeny, that's going to be okay. But if you start to see that it just sitting there up a little bit, you definitely want to get the reeds replaced. And you can see on this one, it's actually starting to chip just a little bit. And it looks like, you know, we have some wear on there. So we actually are going to replace these reeds. The other thing you're going to look for on this intake boot, if you see any cracks that are going through this, definitely get it replaced. Next, we're going to check our ring end gap. So typically you're not going to have to adjust this, but you do want to verify that it is good. So what we're going to do is install one of the piston rings into the cylinder. We'll level that up with our piston. So that's looking pretty good. The gap on a stock piston ring is going to be 0.8 to 0.35 millimeters. But again, we're using the QA parts cylinder and piston kit. And you know, the one for this, they want you to have at least 13 thousandths of an inch gap in there. So that's what we're going to be measuring for on ours. So I'll go straight there. This one actually is just a hair tight. So if you need to adjust this, all you have to do, take this out. We're going to clamp a file into our soft jaws and just barely take a little bit of material from the gap. So we've got our ring end gap adjusted up. That's a super crucial step, so don't skip checking it. Now, once you've done that, make sure you spray the rings off with some contact cleaner, and we're ready to install them onto our piston. A couple things with that, keep in mind that the marking is going to face up. Our markings on this kit say STD, and it's really important with these rings because this is a keystone design. So the flat side of the ring, that's going to face down, and there's actually a taper on top that's going to be facing up. And you have 2 pins in the ring grooves, and you just need to make sure that the ring end gaps line up with those. When you install these, I'll just start with one end. We'll get that all the way in that groove. And both piston rings are actually going to be the same. And I'm just going to work this all the way down into its groove. Be careful that you don't scratch your brand new piston. So we've got that gap centered on that pin. We'll do the same thing for the top ring. Next, I'm going to install the right side circlip. So you can see this arrow on top of the piston that's going to face the exhaust. Now to install this, I'm going to start with that open end. I'm going to set it into that groove. With that in place, I'm going to try to work it on as much as I can just with my fingers. And the whole goal is to not over compress this. And then towards the very end, I'm just barely going to rotate on this with these needle nose pliers, push in on it until the clip pops into place, just like that. And I'll rotate it, make sure it's fully in its groove. I've got that little tab hanging down, that's straight up and down. Next, I'm going to apply some assembly lube to the new wrist pin bearing and the small end of the connecting rod. Set that in there. Then we're going to lube up the piston and rings as well. You can use 2-cycle oil for this or the assembly lube. And you want to lube up that wrist pin. We'll set the piston on. Keep in mind this arrow is going to face the exhaust side. And we'll slide that wrist pin all the way through. Now on the left side of the bike, we'll install the second circlip. And again, I'm just pressing it in as far as I can by hand. We'll finish it off with the needle nose pliers. I've got that tab straight up and down. I'm just going to double check to make sure it's pushed in all the way, just with my screwdriver. That is all the way in there. From here, I'm going to remove that rag for the bottom end. I'll set that cylinder base gasket in place. And when you do that, make sure that The 2 dowel pins on the right side of the machine are still in place on both those studs. Now, just to help me get this installed, I rotated the engine or the piston to bottom dead center. Now, if you're using the QA parts cylinder and piston kit, you do need to wash the cylinder out with warm soapy water, and then as soon as that's washed out, what you need to do is apply some light penetrating oil in there, and then from there I also applied some assembly lube just to be on the safe side. And then we're going to slide this down over our piston, and we're just going to compress these rings with our hands while we do that. There's a little taper on the bottom of the cylinder to help the rings go on. And just keep in mind that you need to keep the rings lined up with those pins as you slide this down. Then we'll make sure the cylinder is lined up with the dowel pins and press it the rest of the way down. Now we can install the 4 base nuts, and don't forget you've got that clutch cable bracket you need to install on there. To get this to the correct torque, we're using the Motion Pro torque wrench adapter. There is a formula. If you need to go straight on, you can calculate for that. But the easy way to do this is to turn the wrench 90 degrees from the torque wrench, and you can just use the manufacturer's recommended torque spec. So in this case, 18 foot-pounds. The next step is to reinstall your cylinder head studs. So really quick, we're just going to rotate the engine over, make sure that piston goes up and down smooth. As long as it does, you can go ahead and clean that sealing surface for the head gasket off. I'm also going to clean that piston crown off as well. Now we can install the cylinder head gasket. So with this, notice that point is facing the exhaust side, and then we have the square edge. So the square edge is going to be on the right side of the ATV. Set the head in place, and then you've got the washers, then the nuts on top, and all of these are going to be torqued to 20 foot-pounds in a crisscross pattern. And we're going to do that in 2 to 3 steps. Next, we'll install the spark plug. Make sure that cap is screwed on all the way. Next, we've got our new gasket on the reed cage. We're going to install that. We've got the intake boot, and we'll just snug down those 4 bolts. After that, we'll reinstall our carburetor. And don't forget to reconnect the Torx wires. Next, we'll install our exhaust gasket and the exhaust. Next, we want to install the exhaust studs from the old cylinder onto this one. Then we're going to loosely install all of the exhaust hardware and start by tightening the exhaust flange nuts. We'll tighten the upper mount and then the clamp in the back. After that, we'll install the spark plug cap. We've got that clip that hooks to the throttle cable. Next, we'll install the gas tank, followed by the plastic covers. After that, you want to install your freshly cleaned air filter and your seat. Now that we have everything back together, we're going to go ahead and start the ATV. And we're going to follow the break-in procedures outlined in the owner's manual. And that's how you rebuild the top end on your Yamaha Blaster. If you need any parts for your Blaster, you can find those on our website. And if you have any questions about the rebuild process, leave those down in the comments below. And if you want to see more helpful content for your Blaster, subscribe to our channel. I'm Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV MC. Thanks for watching.